Now, one thing that came up in through Dr. Anderson, and I know that this became a buzzword that's been sort of tossed around a bunch of times, and a lot of people that are DV survivors particularly don't like it. The term mutual abuse was brought up through Dr. Anderson. Do you guys have any thoughts on the use of that term, whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, or sort of like how you would, if it's inappropriate, how you would prefer it to be referred to,
No.
basically?
It's a well-known phenomenon in the research literature on intimate partner violence. It's been around for decades. I understand people's reticence to using the term, because if you use it unwisely, you can absolutely blame the victim and perpetuate the abuse that's happening to the victim. Just because a victim occasionally defends themselves or freaks out and has a violent outburst once a year or something, that usually, if in that characterization, we wouldn't label that as mutual abuse. We'd say that person just had a temporary violent moment in the midst of an overall systemic abuse, gaslighting experience that person is going through. But yeah, it's well known. In the clinical literature, we might call it bidirectional intimate partner violence, and it's so there's two different categories. There's one where you just have violence, where Dr. Hughes actually talked about this, where people will have non-abusive violence, and it's not a good thing that they're violent with each other, but it's not infused with a message of control and you must obey me and I'm punishing you for something you did and you better watch out, of intimidation. But the other type of bidirectional intimate partner violence, it does have control and intimidation and coercion in it. And it's hard to imagine unless you've seen it, because we don't often acknowledge this in our society, which is why there's a lot of misconceptions among the public. But they will alternate between control and you must obey me. It's, it can be like 1 week on, 1 week off, or it could literally happen in the same conversation. I've seen it in my office where they both come from abusive families, and it's just the way that they deal with attachments, and it's very normalized. They normalize it to each other and it's almost like the victim in that moment will say, "Oh, well, okay, now it's my turn." It's almost like, now I get my justice because I was a jerk face earlier and I deserve it. And they'll go back and forth, and it's hard to identify, because again, for me, when I see that sort of thing, I'm like, I'm always saying, I'm going to assume one person is more the abuser until I'm proven otherwise, because I don't want to blame the victim. You know what I mean? So I'm always really trying to dig down on exactly how often does this happen? How do you feel? Because the other thing is like, if the victim strikes back, the abuser might succumb, but they actually don't feel unsafe. They're just like, "Oh, I'll get you later," So it can look very abusive, but we have to know how the victim is feeling on the inside. And
I see.
Oftentimes that can be hard to get at. So it takes a while.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was just going to emphasize like intensity, the intention of the person that's enacting it, the feeling that the victim or the person receiving the abuse is getting, and the frequency, the intention, the intensity, all of that matters. And I really like what you said, Dr. Honda, about we have to be careful to not be blaming the victim and just assume mutual abuse, even if both parties have been abusive. There's so much nuance in it. It really depends on the initiation of the violence and then what that has become in the totality of the relationship.
It's so interesting to hear that, because coming from a lawyer's perspective, it's like, especially whether or not someone is the abuser, or whether or not someone has been abused, is really a legal question here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very different sort of definition of the term abuse that's being used in a different kind of setting. And I think that that's kind of where one of these sort of disconnects is happening, is that in a clinical setting, where people are going to a couples therapist, the term abuse or mutual abuse might have a different meaning than what it has in a trial or in a court setting, basically.